"You are sending me alone." Lyra Ashvale did not phrase it as a question. She already knew the answer. She had known it from the moment Elder Corvus unrolled the assignment scroll and let his eyes drift past her as if she were made of window glass, as if the cold air of the council chamber passed through her, rather than around her. To the forbidden peaks, in the middle of the frost moon season, Elder Corvus finally looked at her, and what she saw in his pale eyes was not cruelty, not exactly. Because cruelty required effort, and she had never been worth anyone's effort. What she saw was simple convenience. She was available. She was expendable. She was, as always, the answer to a problem that no one else wanted to solve. "The purification ritual must be performed before the new moon," he said, rolling the scroll back with the practiced efficiency of a man who had already moved on to the next item on his list. "You will leave at first light. The climb takes 2 days. You will complete the ritual at the summit stone and return before the council convenes for the solstice gathering." He paused, not for her sake, but to consult his notes. "Try not to die. The paperwork is tiresome." Lyra stood very still in the center of the stone chamber, while the other council assistants gathered their things around her and filtered out through the heavy oak doors, none of them meeting her eyes, none of them offering a word. The cold that lived permanently in the walls of Ashgrave Keep seemed to press closer in their absence, and she breathed it in slowly, that familiar cold, and told herself it did not matter. She had been telling herself that for 23 years. It was the only story she had ever been very good at telling. She was Lyra Ashvale, born to the Ashgrave Pack in the Northern Reach, daughter of parents who had died in a border skirmish before she was old enough to remember their faces, raised by the Pack's collective indifference, notable for exactly nothing. She had no wolf. That was the central fact of her existence, the stone around which everything else arranged itself. Every lichen in the Northern Reach had manifested their wolf by age 16 at the absolute latest. Lyra was 23. The elders had stopped listing her in the manifest of able-bodied pack members 2 years ago. She existed in the administrative category of attached dependents, which was a polite way of saying she was kept around because it was more trouble to formally exile someone than to simply ignore them and assign them the tasks no one else wanted. She picked up the scroll from the council table where Elder Corvus had left it without handing it to her, because even that small gesture of acknowledgement was apparently too much to ask. She read the details of the ritual in the lamplight, the summit stone of the Vale Peaks, the highest accessible point in the entire northern range, a place that the Pack's oldest records described in tones usually reserved for places where people went and did not come back. She was to pour the purification oil, speak the old words, and leave an offering of silver and salt at the base of the stone before the turning of the moon. Simple enough, except for the 2-day climb through terrain that would kill a seasoned warrior in the wrong conditions, and the fact that the frost moon brought ice storms that descended from the upper peaks without warning and could strip the flesh from an exposed traveler in minutes. She folded the scroll neatly, tucked it into the pocket of her wool coat, and went to pack her things. She did not allow herself to feel afraid. Fear was a luxury she had never been able to afford. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. The journey began before the sun had fully committed to rising, which suited Lyra perfectly because she had not slept anyway. She had spent the night in the quiet efficiency of preparation, organizing her pack with the care of someone who understood that details were the difference between living and not living, checking her rope twice and her fire materials 3 times and her supply of dried meat and hard bread with the methodical attention she had always given to things that actually mattered. The pack elders had provided her with a map that was approximately 40 years out of date and a vial of purification oil that smelled of cedar and old magic and something underneath that. She could not name, something that made the tips of her fingers tingle when she held the vial too long. She put it in the interior pocket of her coat, close to her chest, where it sat like a small warm heartbeat against her ribs. The lower slopes of the Vale Peaks were familiar enough. She had gathered medicinal herbs in the foothills for years, trading them to the pack healer in exchange for the small necessities that a dependent with no income had to negotiate for carefully. She knew the paths. Between the silver birch stands, knew where the ground softened dangerously near the underground springs, knew the particular way the wind moved through the valley on clear mornings, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow. But she had never gone higher than the tree line. No one did, not without specific reason, and specific preparation, and usually specific company. The records described the upper peaks as the old territory, the original lichen sacred grounds, abandoned after the fall of the Aing. Stormvil Empire a century ago, when the great packs had fractured and scattered, and the northern reach had eventually coalesced around a new order, the Vale Pack, with Dorian Vale's grandfather as its first alpha king, and the old sacred places left to silence and snow. She crossed the tree line at midday on the first day, and the world changed immediately. Below the tree line there was still texture, still the complexity of living things, roots and bark, and the movement of small animals, the tracks of deer in the softer ground. Above it, there was only stone and ice, and a sky so blue it looked painted. The wind was different up here too, purposeful in a way the valley winds were not, as if it had somewhere to be, and she was in the way. She pulled her hood lower and leaned into the climb with the quiet stubbornness that had gotten her through everything else in her life. One foot, then the other. The summit stone was marked on her map as a cairn at the highest navigable point, roughly another day and a half above her current position. She found a shallow shelter in the lee of a granite outcropping, as the light failed, and ate half her bread and a strip of dried meat, and drank carefully from her water flask, and watched the stars appear one by one in the black sky above her, like an audience gathering for something she could not yet see. She dreamed that night for the first time in years. Not the usual gray formlessness of exhausted sleep, but something vivid and silver. Landscape of ice under moonlight, vast and still, and at its center a shape too large to be real. A wolf made of glacier and starlight, its eyes the precise color of the sky at the moment just before dawn. Not quite night and not quite day, but something in between. Something neither and both. It was looking at her. It had been looking at her for a very long time. She could feel the weight of that gaze like a hand pressed gently against her sternum. Not threatening, just present. A contact so careful and so deliberate it felt almost reverent. She woke with her heart pounding, and her breath visible in the pre-dawn cold, and the absolute certain knowledge that the dream had not been only a dream. The second day of climbing was harder. The path, such as it was, became less a path and more a suggestion, a series of decisions about which surface was most likely to bear her weight and least likely to send her sliding off the mountain in a controlled catastrophe. She moved slowly, and she moved carefully, and she did not allow herself to think about what she would find at the top, or what would happen if the ice storm the sky was threatening came down before she finished the ritual. The vial against her heart had been warm since she woke, warmer than her body temperature could account for, and when she pressed her hand over it through her coat, she felt the tingling in her fingers spread up through her wrist and into her forearm, like water finding channels in stone. She told herself. It was the cold, making her skin oversensitive. She was good at telling herself useful things. The summit stone was not a cairn. She understood immediately upon seeing it that whoever had written the word cairn in the 40-year-old map had either never seen it or had lacked the vocabulary for what it actually was. It rose from the highest point of the peak like a tooth, a single column of dark stone perhaps twice her height, streaked with veins of silver that caught the thin afternoon light and threw it back in fractured patterns across the snow. Old runes were carved into its base, worn by weather and time but still visible if you looked closely. And Lyra looked closely because she had always paid attention to things other people overlooked. She did not recognize the language. It was older than anything in the pack records, older possibly than the pack itself. a script that felt less like written words, and more like the stone itself, had simply remembered something it needed to say. Beyond the summit stone, the peak dropped away into a cirque, a natural bowl carved by ancient glacial movement, and the glacier that filled it was like nothing she had ever seen. It was not the dull blue-white of ordinary ice. It was deep, a color that existed somewhere between sapphire and the particular shade of twilight that happens in the space of a single breath, and within it, lit from below by some light source she could not identify, shapes moved slowly the way shapes move in deep. Water. She stood at the edge of the cirque for a long moment with the wind pulling at her coat and her heart doing something complicated in her chest. And then she took out the purification oil and the scroll, and she began. The old words felt strange in her mouth, not because she did not know them, but because they felt too large for the vessel of her voice, as if she were trying to pour an ocean through a keyhole. She had read them in preparation, committed them to memory, practiced their pronunciation in the silence of her small room in Ashgrave Keep. But here, at the summit stone with the wind carrying her voice away, almost before it could form, they resonated in her chest cavity in a way that had nothing to do with the mechanics of sound. The oil, when she poured it at the base of the stone, caught the thin light and burned with a flame that should not have been possible in that wind. Small and gold and absolutely still, a flame so calm it seemed to be choosing not to be moved, rather than simply being protected from movement. She laid the silver and salt offering with hands that she would not allow to shake. She spoke the final words. She pressed her bare hand against the summit stone because the ritual specified skin contact, and she had followed every instruction to the letter because that was what she did. She did the thing completely, or she did not do it at all. The stone was warm, in the middle of winter, at the top of a glacier peak with the temperature well. Below freezing, and the wind cutting at her exposed face like something with intent. The stone was warm, and more than warm. It was alive with something, a vibration so deep it was below sound, something she felt in her bones and in the chambers of her heart, and in a place at the base of her skull that she had no name for. The runes under her hand lit up, silver against dark stone, one after another in a chain that moved from the base upward, and the glacier beyond the peak's edge began to crack. Not violently, not in the way of disaster, in the way of something opening that had been closed for a very long time, carefully and with great intention, a seam of light appearing in the deep blue ice that widened with slow majesty while the surface trembled, and the night fell suddenly and completely around her, as if the sun had simply decided it had seen enough and gone home. She should have run. She would examine that fact later and wonder at herself. She stood her ground, her hand still, against the warm stone, and she watched the glacier open. He emerged the way a mountain emerges from cloud after a storm, gradually and then all at once, impossibly large, skin pale as the ice itself, hair the deep black of the sky between stars, eyes that opened and found the darkness, and then found her. Silver. His eyes were the precise shade she had dreamed. He stood on the surface of the glacier in the ruins of the ice that had held him, and he breathed, one long intake, and the breath that came out of him was not cold vapor, but something that moved like light, like the memory of warmth, like a century of patience finally released into the air. He was dressed as if time had not touched him, heavy furs and dark leather, the marks of kingship she recognized from old paintings in the pack archives, the triple-point sigil of the Stormvil line carved in silver at the collar of his coat. He looked at her, and she felt the mate bond hit her like a wall of water, like falling, like the floor dropping away beneath everything she had ever known about herself and the world. "You," he said. His voice was the sound of ice moving in deep water, resonant and ancient and absolutely certain. "I have waited 100 years, and still you are precisely on time." Lyra Ashvale, who had never been the answer to anything in her life, stood at the top of the world with her heart in pieces and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, because the universe had apparently decided to be dramatic about this, and she was going to need considerably more than a moment to process what was happening. The wolf she had never had stirred somewhere deep inside her for the very first time, not powerfully, not yet, but there, unmistakably there, like an ember in a hearth that had been cold for a very long time, finally remembering what it was made for. His name was Stormvil, and he was the last true Alpha King of the Northern Realm, and he had been dead, or as close to dead as a lichen of. His bloodline could be forced into being for exactly 100 years, 2 months, and 17 days. He knew the count because he had counted, in the particular way that consciousness counts things when it has nothing else to do, when it is suspended in cold and silence with only the memory of a face and the weight of a destiny to keep it from dissolving entirely into the dark. He had known she would come. The witch who had sealed him had told him, at the very end, with the particular cruelty of someone who wants their victim to understand exactly how precisely they are trapped, that the seal would only break when a daughter of Ilara's blood stood at the summit stone and completed the old ritual. She had told him this because she had believed Ilara's line was already ended, already dead by the assassins the witch herself had sent. She had been wrong. The knowledge of that wrongness was the thing that had kept him. He looked at the young woman who had broken his seal, and the recognition that moved through him was older than his own memory, deeper than thought. The particular knowledge of the mate bond that does not ask permission and does not offer explanation, but simply is. The way a river simply is. The way the turning of seasons simply is. Inevitable and complete, and not subject to argument. She was looking at him with amber eyes wide and steady, in a face gone entirely still with the effort of not showing what she was feeling. And he recognized that too, the particular courage of someone who has learned to control their expressions as a matter of survival, someone who has been hurt enough times that they have built the blankness into a kind of armor. His heart, which had been ice for a century, did something that might have been breaking, if hearts could break with tenderness. "You are afraid," he said. "I am not afraid," she said, immediately, and with the automatic precision of someone who has said those words many times to themselves and others. "I am confused. There is a difference." "There is," he agreed. He moved toward her slowly, the way he had learned long ago that you moved toward wild things that had reason to distrust you, with your intentions visible in every line of your body, and your pace adjusted to theirs. She held her ground, which told him everything he needed to know about her. The summit was bitterly cold, and the wind was picking up with the intent of becoming something worse. And he registered these facts distantly, because his body was already reorienting to the living world, pulling heat from the deep reserves of a Lichen King's constitution. But she was human, cold, and her lips were starting to show the blue of genuine chill. He reached her, and she looked up at him, and the mate bond sang between them so loudly he was surprised she could not hear it as sound. "We need to move off this peak," he said. "The storm will be here in an hour. I will explain everything I can while we walk. But first I need you to understand one thing." "What thing?" she said. "You are not alone anymore," he said. "Whatever you believed before this moment, whatever they told you that you were or were not, whatever shape they decided to put around you to make you easier to ignore, you are not alone. You were never meant to be alone. And I am sorry that I kept you waiting." Lyra Ashvale, who had not cried in 4 years because she had decided that crying was a waste of water, and she was never warm enough to afford it, felt something move through her chest with the slow inevitability of a glacier calving. She did not cry, but it was a closer thing than she would have admitted to anyone. She turned and began moving off the summit, and he fell into step beside her, enormous and steady as a mountain walking, and for the first time in her memory, the cold did not feel like punishment. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below, getting him off the mountain and into the lower forest. Without being seen was the first practical problem, and Lyra had always been good at practical problems. She knew the paths that the pack's border scouts did not bother to watch because they were considered too difficult for anything worth worrying about. She knew the timing of the patrol rotations from years of moving carefully around the edges of her own pack's territory. Not from hostility, but from the simple necessity of someone who had learned that avoiding attention was usually safer than inviting it. Cale followed her direction without argument, which surprised her, because nothing about him suggested a man accustomed to following anyone's lead. He moved through the terrain with the fluid efficiency of a predator who had spent centuries at the top of every hierarchy that existed. But he adjusted his pace to hers, and he kept his presence condensed somehow, pulled in, less enormous in effect than in reality. And she appreciated that without saying so. She brought him to the old shepherd's shelter in the high meadow, a single-room structure of stacked stone with a roof that had been repaired sufficiently to keep out the worst of the weather, abandoned for 20 years but stocked, by Lyra's own careful habit, with a small cache of emergency supplies she had built up over the course of several years, because she was someone who had learned to maintain exit strategies even when she had nowhere to exit to. She got the fire started, and he watched her do it with an expression she could not quite categorize, something between wonder and grief, as if every ordinary action she performed was simultaneously mundane and precious to him. "Talk," she said, when the fire was established and she had wrapped her hands around a cup of heated water, because she could not quite feel her fingers yet. "Start from the beginning. Not the very beginning, because I do not have enough water for that, but from whatever beginning is actually relevant to why I just accidentally thawed a 100-year-old king out of a glacier." He sat across the fire from her, and for a moment he was silent, and she watched the firelight move across the planes of his face, and thought with the part of her brain that she was not currently using for analysis that he was the most singularly overwhelming person she had ever seen. Not precisely because of beauty, though that was certainly present, but because of density, the sense of him as something real in a way that made other things feel approximate by comparison. Then he began to speak, and she listened with the focused attention she had always given to things that mattered. His story, condensed to its essentials, was this. 100 years ago, the Stormvil Empire had been the dominant power in the Northern Realm, a confederation of pack territories stretching from the coast to the mountain range, held together by the authority of the Alpha King's bloodline and a network of alliances maintained over generations. It had not been a perfect empire. He said this without defensiveness. It had been a complicated one, as all things built by human and lichen hands inevitably are. But it had been his, and he had given it his whole life. He had been 34 years old, in lichen terms, a king in his full power. He had been in the process of preparing for the greatest ceremony of his reign, the claiming, the public ritual by which an Alpha King formally acknowledges his destined mate and binds her into the rulership beside him. Her name had been Alara. She had been the most remarkable person he had ever known, a low-born lichen from the Southern Territories who had wandered into his life during a diplomatic journey and simply refused to leave it, not through scheming or ambition, but through the sheer force of being exactly herself, with a consistency that defeated every political argument against the match. He paused there, and the fire between them spoke for a moment in the language of small crackling sounds, and Lyra held her cup and waited. Alara had been killed 3 days before the claiming ceremony, by agents of a woman named Mira, who had served the court as an advisor, and who had wanted the king's claiming for herself not out of love, but out of the specific hunger of someone who has spent their whole life calculating power, and has mistaken the instrument of power for the thing itself. Mira had been a witch of considerable ability, which she had concealed beneath the performance of a perfectly ordinary pack noble, and when her agents failed to kill Cale as well, she had used that ability to lay the curse, trapping him in the glacier with a seal tied to a condition she believed impossible to meet. The pack territories had fractured in the chaos that followed his disappearance. A new order had assembled over the following decades, the Veil Pack, rising to dominance under a succession of Alpha Kings, who had systematically dismantled what remained of Stormvil influence and rewritten the historical record to position themselves as a natural evolution rather than an opportunistic conquest. And Alara, Lyra said. She already knew the shape of the answer, but she asked it anyway because she needed to hear it. She had a sister, Kale said. Younger, who had been sent away from court before the assassination. She survived. She lived quietly in the outer territories, changed her name, built a small life as far as possible from anything that might attract attention. He looked at Lyra. Directly. Her name was Ashveel. The fire between them was the only sound in the shelter for a long moment. Lyra thought about the name she had always carried, the name of a family she had no memory of, the name she had simply been given as an infant when she arrived at Ashgrave Keep with no context and no explanation, and no one who claimed her. She thought about the way the summit stone had felt under her hand. She thought about the warmth of the purification oil vial against her heart, all those years of it sitting in the pack archives unclaimed, available to be assigned to the person no one else wanted to send. She thought about a wolf she had never had, stirring for the first time in 23 years at the sound of a voice emerging from 100 years of ice. "You are telling me," she said slowly, "that I am the reason you are not still frozen in that glacier. You are the reason I was able to survive 100 years in that glacier," he said. "There is a difference." She almost smiled. It surprised her enough that she stopped it, tucking it back somewhere internal. But he saw it. She could tell from the way something in his expression shifted, subtle and significant, like the first movement of a very slowly turning tide. "That is my line," she said. "Then we are already beginning to understand each other," he said. The problem, as they moved from the immediate to the strategic in the conversation that followed, was multifaceted and not particularly kind to either of them. Kale was alive and free, and in full possession of his faculties and his lichen abilities. But he was a king with no court, no territory, no army, and no legal standing in a political landscape that had been built specifically to ensure that no one like him could exist without challenge. Lyra was his mate, and apparently the sole surviving heir of a bloodline that carried ancient lichen magic in its veins. But she was a nobody, an unshifted omega dependent in a mid-tier pack with no allies, no resources, and the active goodwill of approximately no one. Against them, they had the entire established order of the Northern Realm, including the current Alpha King Dorian Vale, who was by all accounts shrewd and ruthless, and deeply committed to maintaining the order that sustained his power. And somewhere in the background, though she had not been seen in a century, the possibility of Mira, whose curse had been broken, but whose own fate was unaccounted for. "We need information." "Before we can move," Lyra said. She was thinking through it methodically, the way she had always thought through problems, by starting with what was concrete and working outward. "I can go back to Ashgrave Keep. I have access to the pack archives. The oldest records, the ones from before the Vale consolidation, they are stored in the lower level. I have been down there. I know where the maps are, the territory records, the old alliance documents. If any of the Stormvil network still exists in any form, it would be documented there." She paused. "It will look suspicious if I return without the ritual completion report. I completed the ritual, technically, so I can report that honestly. I just will not report the rest of it." "You are very calm," he said. "I am not calm," she said. "I am organized. There is a difference." She looked at him across the fire. "You cannot come into the keep with me. You are too visible. You are too much. Whatever you are, the moment anyone senses your presence, the entire situation becomes unmanageable." She hesitated, and then said the thing she was thinking, because she had never seen any particular use in not saying what she was thinking. "Can you control the mate bond response? Can you be near me without it being obvious to any lichen in sensing range?" The expression that crossed his face at that question was complicated in a way she did not yet have the reference to fully read. "I can suppress it," he said. "To a degree. At distance." Paused. "Can you?" "I do not know what it feels like from the inside yet," she said honestly. "I have never experienced it before. I will need to learn its textures before I can manage them." She set down her empty cup. "We need a signal system, and I need to know where you will be if things go wrong." "Things will not go wrong," he said. "Things always have the potential to go wrong," she said. "That is not pessimism, it is planning. Where will you be?" He looked at her for a moment with that expression she was beginning to learn, the one that was simultaneously ancient and immediate. And then he told her about the old Stormvil way station 2 hours walk east of Ashgrave Keep, a structure that would not appear on any Vale-era map, but that he knew the location of as precisely as he knew his own heartbeat, because he had ridden through it 100 times before the world changed. She had her signal system in the form of a particular kind of stone arrangement that would mean different things depending on the count and configuration. She filed all of it away with the efficient care she gave to details that mattered. Then she banked the fire and lay down to sleep because she needed to be functional in the morning, and she lay in the dark and felt the mate bond between them like a rope of warm light connecting her sternum to a point across the small room, steady and bright and thoroughly impossible. And she thought about Alara, whom she had never known, who had been killed for loving the wrong king at the wrong time. And she made a quiet, private promise to the ghost of a great aunt she would never meet to be smarter about it. Then she slept. She walked back into Ashgrave. Keep the following afternoon with tired legs and a face full of windburn, and her report tucked under her arm, and Elder Corvus looked up from his desk with the expression of a man mildly surprised to find a piece of furniture that had inconvenienced him has reappeared. "The ritual is complete," she said, setting the report in front of him. "The summit stone accepted the offering. No complications." She had debated what to put in the written report for the entire walk down, and had settled on an account that was technically accurate in every particular. The purification ritual had been completed. The stone had accepted the offering. The seal, which the report described as a residual magical resonance detected in the stone, now neutralized, had indeed been neutralized. Everything she wrote was true. Nothing she wrote was the actual truth. It was the finest thing she had ever written, and she was obscurely proud of it. Elder Corvus read it with the attention of a man who had already decided it was not interesting, and signed off on it and dismissed her. And she walked through the keep corridors, with her hands in her pockets, and the mate bond humming at the edge of her awareness, like a song being played in a room just beyond earshot. And she thought about the archives. The lower archive of Ashgrave Keep was not a secret exactly, but it was not advertised. It occupied the oldest part of the building, a series of chambers cut directly into the rock foundation, where the temperature was cold enough year-round to preserve paper that would otherwise have decayed centuries ago. Lyra had discovered it 4 years earlier, while cataloging the Keep's stores inventory, an assignment that had been given to her because it was tedious, and she was available, and she had spent 3 weeks in those cold stone rooms learning that the pack's written memory was both vaster and stranger than anyone upstairs seemed to know or care about. She had read things down there that had unsettled her, old histories and older maps and documents in languages she had taught herself the rudiments of over the following years, with the help of a translation guide she had found in the same archives, apparently left there by a scholar who had come to similar realizations and then disappeared from the historical record without explanation. She went there the night after her return, after the keep had settled into its nightly rhythms and the corridors were empty. She brought a lamp and her translation notes, and the particular focused attention she had always applied to things that mattered, and she went looking for everything the Vale Pack had tried to make disappear about the Stormvale Empire. It took her 3 nights. She did not sleep much. What she found was enough to make the sleeplessness feel like a reasonable trade. The Stormvale records were extensive, buried beneath layers of subsequent misfiling that might have been deliberate, or might have simply been the accumulated negligence of generations of archivists who had not known what they were looking at. She found the original territorial maps, showing the full extent of the empire at its peak, with pack boundaries marked in the old notation system that the Vale administration had replaced with their own. She found the alliance records, some of which bore signatures she recognized as the ancestral names of packs that still existed and were still notionally independent under Vale governance. Packs that had made treaty with Stormvil kings before the fall, and whose current leadership might or might not know what their ancestors had committed to. She found, in a water-damaged bundle that nearly disintegrated when she touched it, a series of personal letters, and the signature on those letters made her sit, back on her heels on the cold stone floor, and press her hand against her mouth, and feel the entirety of the situation settle onto her shoulders, like something that had been looking for somewhere to land. The letters were from Alara, written to her sister, the sister who had been sent away, who had become Ash Vale. She brought them upstairs and read them in her room with the lamp burning low, and her hands very steady because she would not allow them to shake. And the woman who came out of those letters was someone she had never expected to find in the archive of an empire she had not known she was connected to. Ilara was funny in the letters, sharp and irreverent and deeply kind, with the particular warmth of someone who loves the people in their life with full attention rather than performance. She described the Alpha King in terms that were at once deeply personal and absolutely clear about who he was. Not a figurehead, not a symbol, but a person. Someone she had argued with about foreign policy and laughed with about a horse that had stepped on his foot during a formal ceremony and held in the dark hours before dawn when the weight of everything he carried became briefly too much to carry alone. She described the claiming ceremony she was preparing for, the dress, the ritual, the way she had felt when he had asked her in the simple private language of their shared life, rather than in the formal political declaration that would have come first. She described being happy, in the specific words of someone who had not expected to be happy and was not quite sure what to do with it, except receive it carefully. The last letter was dated 3 days before her death. It was not a farewell letter. She had not known it was the last one. It was a letter about the flowers that had been chosen for the ceremony, and a joke about one of the court advisors, and a postscript about wanting to see her sister again soon, now that the ceremony was approaching and the political situation had stabilized enough to make a visit possible. Then it simply ended, mid-thought, in the way that lives end, not with resolution, but with interruption. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. Lyra folded the letters with the same care she had given everything in the archive and held them in her lap in the cold of her room and let herself feel, for exactly 3 minutes by the count of the tallow lamp's slow burn, the full weight of what had been taken. From Ilara, from Kyle, from the sister who had run and hidden and built a small life from the ruins of a larger one. From her own parents, who had carried this blood without knowing its full implications and died on a border that had probably been drawn without their consent. Then she put the feeling in the place she kept feelings that were too large for the present moment, and she began to plan. She had allies, potentially. The old treaty packs. 3 of them were within 2 days' travel of Ashgrave Keep. 2 more were within a week's journey. If the current pack leaders knew enough of their own history to understand what a Stormvil heir meant, and if Kale's return could be verified in a way that was convincing rather than simply claimed, the Alliance network could be rebuilt from bones that had never entirely decayed. The trick was doing it quietly enough that Dorian Vale did not hear about it before they were ready to be heard. Lyra was very good at doing things quietly. She had spent her entire life being overlooked. She had always intended to find a use for that eventually. What she had not planned for was Lady Seraphine. She became aware of Lady Seraphine on her 4th day back in Ashgrave Keep, which was how long it took for the Alpha King's personal delegation, which had arrived while Lyra was in the archives, to make its presence fully felt in the rhythms of the keep. The delegation was ostensibly visiting to discuss the trade agreement between Ashgrave Pack and the Vale administration, a standard annual negotiation that Lyra would normally have had no involvement with and no reason to notice. But Lady Seraphine was not standard. She was Dorian Vale's betrothed, and she moved through Ashgrave Keep with the particular confidence of someone who has calculated every angle before entering the room and is pleasantly certain that all of them work in her favor. She was beautiful in the way that certain dangerous things are beautiful, clean, and precise, and very obviously designed to be looked at while attention was being devoted elsewhere. She wore her chestnut hair in a style that managed to be simultaneously perfect and apparently effortless, which Lyra recognized as an achievement that required considerable effort and was thus its own form of deception. Lyra would have been able to avoid her entirely if she had been the person she appeared to be on paper, an unshifted omega dependent with no relevance to anything, invisible and irrelevant. But she was no longer entirely that person, if she had ever truly been, and the mate bond that connected her to a man 2 hours east was doing something new, since she had spent 3 nights in the archives with Alara's letters, something that felt less like a distant warmth and more like an actual presence, a heightened awareness of everything around her, as if she were perceiving the world through more than her usual senses. She was coming out of the lower archive on the morning of the 4th day when she turned a corner and walked directly into Lady Seraphine, and the fraction of a second in which Seraphine's eyes swept over her was enough. Lyra saw the recognition, not of her face, because Seraphine had certainly never seen her face before, of something else, of something that made Seraphine's perfectly composed expression flicker with a single cold thought before reassembling itself into polite courtesy. "I am so sorry," Seraphine said, stepping back with practiced grace. "I did not see you." "No one ever does," Lyra said, and smiled, and moved on. She sent the signal to Kale that night. Not the emergency signal, the alert signal, the one that meant she had information and needed contact. She left it in the agreed configuration in the old garden at the keep's eastern wall, 3 stones in a specific arrangement, and went back to her room to wait. By morning, there was a folded note tucked under the gap of her door, written in a hand that was both archaic in its letter forms and unmistakably clear in its meaning. He had seen the delegation arrive. He knew who Seraphine was. He was concerned. He had not been idle in his own days since the Glacier, and what he had learned about the current state of the old Stormvil network was both better and worse than either of them had hoped. They needed to meet properly. He named a place and a time, and signed it with a single initial, and Lyra folded it and burned it in her lamp flame, and began thinking about how to leave the keep without being observed. Seraphine watched her leave. Lyra did not know this with certainty, but she felt it with the new sense that was still developing in her, an awareness that prickled at the back of her neck like a gaze she could not locate. She moved through the morning market in the village outside the keep walls, and turned 2 unnecessary corners, and doubled back through the tanner's alley, and was fairly certain she was alone by the time she reached the old mill at the edge of pack territory. Kale was there before her, leaning against the wall in a way that managed to be both casual and completely alert. And the mate bond responded to his proximity with something that was getting harder to categorize as merely warmth. She gave him everything she had learned in the archive. He gave her what he had learned from his own movements through the outlying territories, meeting with people who remembered the old stories and who had, in some cases, been waiting for exactly this situation, with a patience that matched his own. 2 of the old treaty packs were in positions of genuine dissatisfaction with Vale governance. A third was ruled by an elder who had been a child during the fall, and who had never publicly repeated his grandfather's name, but who had made certain quiet preparations over the years that had no other logical explanation. The bones were there. What they needed was a catalyst. The solstice gathering, Lyra said. She had been thinking about it since reading the Ashgrave Council's internal correspondence, which she had access to as part of her archive duties and which she read with complete attention every time it was available. Dorian Vale will be at the gathering. Every pack in the Northern Reach sends representatives. It is the one time in the year when the entire political order is in the same place at the same time. She paused. There is an old provision in the gathering charter, pre-Vale. I found it in the original. Documents. Any lichen of established noble lineage can invoke the right of blood recognition before the assembled packs. It is a formal challenge to the existing order of succession, but it has to be done in person, before witnesses, with evidence of lineage. She looked at him. You are an established noble lineage. I am the lineage, he said, with the quiet precision of a man stating a fact. But the evidence. I have it, she said. Ilara's letters, the old territorial maps, the alliance, documents, the original claiming records that were filed before the ceremony and never formally annulled because there was no one left to annul them. She had thought about this in the small hours of the previous night with the lamp burning low. A claiming that was formally initiated but not completed by the death of one party is, under the old law, still legally binding in potential, which means the Alpha King's intended mate at the time of his cursing is technically still the Alpha Queen. Waiting. And her line's heir. She stopped. She had not quite finished saying this thought aloud to herself yet. Is you, he said. Is technically me, she said. Which is either the most powerful legal argument I have ever constructed or the most absurd, depending on your perspective. It is both, he said, which is what makes it effective. He was looking at her with an expression she was beginning to find simultaneously unnerving and deeply settling, the expression of someone who sees you completely and likes what they see completely, which was an experience she had no previous reference for. Lyra, what you are describing is extremely dangerous. Not simply politically. Seraphine is not ordinary opposition. Mira's curse was designed with sophisticated craft, and I have no certainty that Mira herself has not been alive and waiting in some form. If they become aware of what you are before we are in a position to make the public challenge, they will not hesitate. I know, she said. I have been not hesitated at by people my entire life. I am accustomed to the risk of existing. She held his gaze. The question is whether we do this carefully and slowly, and give them time to find and eliminate us before we are ready, or whether we do it at the gathering in 3 weeks, and take the risk of being underprepared over the certainty of being eventually discovered. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, You are like her. She knew who he meant. I know, she said, more gently than she had said most things. I read her letters. The 3 weeks before the solstice gathering were the most complicated and the most alive that Lyra had ever spent. She continued her duties at Ashgrave Keep with the same invisible efficiency that had always characterized them, and underneath that surface, she moved with the precision of someone conducting a campaign, communicating through the signal system and through carefully worded letters delivered by means she had spent years establishing, building the network that needed to exist before the gathering, pulling threads that the Vale administration had not bothered to watch because they had never imagined anyone would pull them. Cale worked the outlying territories, moving with the knowledge of a man who had built the original network and understood its architecture in a way that no amount of careful study could fully replicate. The old treaty packs began, quietly, to orient themselves. Not publicly. Not yet. But the conversations happened, and the agreements were made, and the bones became structure. Seraphine noticed that something was changing. Lyra watched her notice it. In the small tells of a woman whose primary instrument was observation, and who was accustomed to having better information than she currently had. She asked questions, through the small social channels of the delegation visit, that were subtle enough to be deniable, but pointed enough to be concerning. She asked about the ritual on the Vale Peaks. She asked, with perfect casualness, whether any unusual phenomena had been reported in the mountain range in recent days. She asked, with even more perfect casualness, whether the Ashgrave Pack's archive was accessible to outside scholars, because she had an interest in pre-Vale historical documents. That last question was the one that made Lyra move faster. She finished the document compilation she needed for the gathering that night, working in the archive with the lamp burning, until her eyes ached. She prepared 2 copies of everything, one for the gathering presentation, and one sealed and sent to the elder of the most reliably aligned treaty pack, as insurance. She wrote the formal invocation of the right of blood recognition with the care of someone who understood that words in the right form, at the right moment, carried the weight of law. And she read it back to herself quietly in the cold of the archive, and thought it was probably the best thing she had ever written, and also probably the most dangerous. 4 days before the gathering, Seraphine made her move. It was not a direct move. Lyra appreciated the sophistication of that, in the abstract way that one can appreciate an opponent's technique, even while experiencing its effects. What Seraphine did was arrange for Lyra to be formally reassigned from archive duties to the lowest tier of keep service, the kind of work performed by dependents with no other function, with the result that her archive access was revoked, and she would be expected to spend the gathering period performing domestic tasks rather than attending the public sessions. The order came through Elder Corvus, who signed it without reading it particularly carefully and filed it with the same indifference he applied to everything concerning Lyra. It was neat. It would have been effective against the person she had appeared to be 6 months ago. It was not effective against the person she was now, primarily because the copies she needed were already made, and the invocation was already written, and the archive had already given her everything it had to give. She smiled when she read the reassignment order, and felt, for the first time since this began, something that was not merely the cold efficiency of planning, something warmer, something that had to do with the letters she had read, and the ancient mate bond that was now fully present in her blood, and the wolf that moved in her when she least expected it. Still quiet, but no longer dormant, testing the edges of its own existence with the tentative curiosity of a creature discovering it is no longer confined. She was ready. The solstice gathering was held, as it always was, in the neutral territory of the old meeting grounds 3 hours' travel from Ashgrave Keep, on a plain surrounded by hills that created a natural amphitheater, and the tradition of the gathering was one of the few Vale-era institutions that had retained the bones of the old structure intact. Every pack in the northern reach was represented. The Alpha King himself presided from the central platform, flanked by his advisors and his betrothed, and Seraphine stood at his right hand with her composed beauty and her calculating eyes, and watched every arrival with the attention of someone cataloging threats. Lyra watched her watch the arrivals from the edge of the assembly grounds where she had positioned herself early, inconspicuous in the crowd of lower-ranking attendees and Omega dependents who gathered at the periphery of events they were expected to witness, but not participate in. Kale was here. She could feel him before she saw him, the mate bond a clear, warm signal that located him in the crowd with the reliability of a compass. He had come in with the delegation of one of the old treaty pack elders, a carefully negotiated arrangement that gave him legitimate presence at the gathering without triggering immediate recognition. He looked different in the crowd than he had on the glacier and in the shepherd's shelter and the old mill meetings, or rather he looked the same, but the context made the difference visible in a new way. Everyone around him was slightly diminished by proximity, not by any effort on his part, but by the simple fact of what he was. A presence that rewrote the spatial mathematics of whatever room or field it entered. She watched several people glance at him, and look away, and look back again. The double take of an instinct, registering something significant before the conscious mind could name it. Dorian Vale was handsome in the political way, well-maintained and well-presented, the handsomeness of someone who understands that appearance is a tool and tends it accordingly. He opened the gathering with the traditional words and a voice trained for projection and authority, and Lyra listened to him speak and thought about the man in the original documents who had carved an empire from nothing and then been stolen from it, and felt the difference between authority and legitimacy as a physical sensation. She waited for the formal business session to begin, for the trade agreements and territorial reports and diplomatic correspondence to be read into the record, because the right of blood recognition had to be invoked during formal business, not in the social hours, not in ceremony, but in the official proceeding where everything was witnessed and recorded and legally binding. She waited with the patience she had always had, the patience of someone who had spent her entire life waiting for something, and had only recently understood what that something was. The sun moved across the sky above the meeting grounds, and the formal business session began, and she moved through the crowd with careful intention toward the platform. The pack elder, whose delegation had brought Kale in, caught her eye as she passed, and gave her a single nod. The other aligned elders were in their positions. The document copies she had distributed were in hands she trusted as much as she trusted anyone, which was not absolute trust, but was the functional trust of people who had reasons that aligned with hers. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. The rest was the particular moment that no amount of preparation can fully account for, the moment when you step forward and say the thing that cannot be unsaid, and trust that the truth of it is sufficient. She reached the edge of the platform and raised her voice in the formal invocation cadence. I invoke the right of blood recognition, as established in the original gathering charter, before these assembled witnesses. The formal business session did not stop immediately, because the assembled packs had not heard that phrase in living memory, and several of the officials on the platform were clearly not certain they had heard it correctly. Then it stopped. The silence that came down over the meeting grounds was the particular silence of a very large number of people collectively reassessing what kind of event they were at. Dorian Vale turned and looked at her, and Seraphine turned and looked at her, and the expression on Seraphine's face in that moment was the expression of someone who had miscalculated and knows it, and is already calculating how to recover. She had moved too late to block the archive access in a way that mattered. She had underestimated what could be accomplished by someone who had always been overlooked, because she had never had to be overlooked herself, and did not understand what it taught you. I am Lyra Ashvale, she said. Her voice did not shake. It had never shaken when it mattered. Born of the Ashvale line, descended directly from Ilara of Stormvil, formerly designated mate of the Alpha King, whose claiming was initiated 100 years ago under the old law and never dissolved. She held up the invocation document. I invoke this right on behalf of myself and on behalf of the lawful Alpha King, whose claiming I represent, who is present in this assembly, and whose identity I will demonstrate by lineage, testimony, and the ancient recognition rites, before these witnesses and before the record. There was a sound from the crowd that was not quite a voice and not quite silence, the collective sound of several hundred people processing information simultaneously. This is absurd, Dorian Vale said, with the smooth, controlled authority of a man who has managed crises before. The Stormvil line is extinct. This is either a delusion or a fraud. The Stormvil line is standing in this assembly, Lyra said, and I have the documentary evidence to establish both his claim and mine, witnessed and sealed, distributed to the pack archives of 3 independent territories before this morning. She paused. The copies cannot be recalled. The testimony is already on record. All that remains is the recognition right. Kale stepped forward from the crowd. He did not do it dramatically. He simply moved, and the crowd parted around him the way water parts around something immovable. Not because anyone made the conscious decision to step aside, but because the body knew what the mind had not yet processed. He walked to the platform, and he stood beside Lyra, and the mate bond between them blazed. There was no other word for it, blazed like something that had been held in reserve for 100 years, and was no longer interested in being held. Several of the elder lichens in the assembly made sounds that she would understand later as the involuntary response to sensing an Alpha King's full presence, a response older than language and more reliable than loyalty. Dorian Vale looked at Kale and something moved across his face that he controlled quickly, but not quite quickly enough. Recognition. not of the person, because he had never seen the person. Recognition of the thing behind the person, the authority that did not ask permission and did not need the political structure, because it was older than the political structure. Dorian Vale, Kyle said. His voice was what it had been on the glacier, resonant and old, the voice of something that had been waiting a very long time to speak again. I do not come to this assembly with war. I come with law. The same law that governed this territory before your grandfather made his calculations. I will honor every alliance your administration has made in good faith. I will acknowledge every legitimate governance structure that has served the Pax well, but I will not cede the recognition that is mine by blood and by the confirmation of this assembly, if the assembly chooses to give it. He looked out at the crowd, and the crowd looked back, and in the quiet of that exchange, something moved that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the ancient understanding that runs deeper than alliances and territories. I am Kale Stormvil. I am home. Seraphine moved then, because she had understood from the beginning that there would be a moment when the political options closed, and the only remaining option was a different kind of action. She was reaching for something under her coat, something that smelled of old magic and specific intent, and Lyra felt it before she saw it with the new sense that was no longer new, the sense that had been growing since the glacier, since the archive, since 3 weeks of learning to trust it. She stepped between Seraphine and Kale with no particular thought about whether it was wise, because there was no time for thought, and the wolf in her was finally, fully awake. The power that came up through her was the thing she had not known she was carrying for 23 years. The thing that had been waiting not for permission, but for witness. The ancient Stormvil blood magic that Alara had carried and passed down, and that had arrived at this moment through the long, patient chain of a lineage that had survived everything thrown at it. It was not the controlled shift of a trained lichen. It was not violent or destructive. It was something more fundamental than that. A radiance that moved outward from her, like the first light of a sun rising, touching everything it reached, with a clarity that had nothing to do with power, and everything to do with truth. The assembled lichens felt it. She could see them feel it, the elder pack leaders straightening as if something had been confirmed, the younger members pressing forward with the automatic response to a presence their instincts recognized as fundamental. Seraphine stopped. The thing she had been reaching for fell from her hand, and the old magic it contained scattered on the ground like smoke, because it had been designed to work against an ordinary lichen, and Lyra was demonstrably not ordinary, had never been ordinary, had simply been unwitnessed, which was not the same thing at all. The recognition rite, when it was performed, felt like the completion of something that had begun long before either of them was born. Kale spoke the old words, and Lyra spoke the old words, and between them the bond that had existed since the glacier became public and permanent, and witnessed by every pack in the northern reach, in a way that no political decision could unmake. She felt it settle into her bones like something coming home, the belonging she had always been able to feel the absence of, but had never had a word for. The specific peace of standing in the exact place where you were supposed to be, next to the exact person you were supposed to be next to. Finally, after everything. Dorian Vale made the calculations that a pragmatic man makes when the numbers change. He was not a good man in the simplest sense, but he was not entirely a fool either. And he understood that the assembly had witnessed what it had witnessed, and the alliance structure had shifted in ways that could not be shifted back by force, without creating a war that would cost more than it could possibly gain. He inclined his head in the formal acknowledgement of a political reality, and Lyra watched him do it, and thought that it was probably the most honest thing he had done in years. Seraphine was taken into custody by the Assembly's own security officers for the attempted use of prohibited magic in a formal proceeding, and she went with the composed dignity of a woman who has lost a battle and is already thinking about subsequent ones, which was honestly the thing about her that Lyra respected most. She was not finished. But she was not the immediate problem anymore. The evening of the solstice gathering was the longest and most detailed conversation Lyra had ever participated in, as the pack elders and their delegates navigated the practical implications of what had just happened with the collective thoroughness of people who understood that the principle was settled and the details would determine everything. Cale negotiated with the patience and precision of a man who had spent a century considering how to do exactly this, honoring every legitimate arrangement while establishing the framework for what would come after. Lyra sat at his right hand and contributed to the negotiations when her particular knowledge was relevant and was silent when it was not, and the elder Lycan, who had carried the memory of the old alliance longest, looked at her across the negotiating table at one point and said, with the simple directness of great age, "You are very like her. It is not a small thing to be like her." And Lyra thought about the letters in their bundle in the archive and said, "No, it is not." The wolf, when she finally shifted, in the privacy of the first night after the gathering with Cale beside her, under a sky full of stars and no one watching except the mountains, was the color of amber, a warm, impossible gold that the old text described and that she had never expected to see on herself. The mark of the Stormvil female line, the color that meant something specific to the very old part of the Lycan world that remembered what colors meant. She stood on 4 legs in the snow under the stars and understood for the first time in 23 years what it felt like to be entirely herself, all of herself, without the weight of anything subtracted. The feeling was enormous. She carried it carefully, the way you carry things that are enormously precious, with both hands and full attention, and the specific joy of knowing you will never have to put it down. Kyle shifted beside her, his wolf enormous and dark as winter sky, and the mate bond between them was a warmth that made the cold irrelevant, that made the 100 years irrelevant, that made the distance between what had been and what was now irrelevant in the way that only the truly essential can make the merely historical irrelevant. They ran together under the solstice stars, over ground that had been his and was his again, and was now hers as well, and the northern reach was silent around them, with the particular silence of a world that has just remembered something important about itself. The work that followed was the longer and in many ways harder work. The rebuilding, the reestablishment, the patient reconstruction of a governance structure that could honor both the old legitimacy and the new reality, the navigation of Dorian Vale's grudging but real cooperation, the pursuit of every thread of Mira's old network through archives and investigation, and the careful undoing of a century of careful damage. Lyra was good at the work. She had always been good at the work that no one else wanted to do, and it turned out that the skills developed by a lifetime of invisibility, attention to detail, patience with tedium, the ability to find what has been deliberately misfiled, translated remarkably well to the work of rebuilding an empire from the evidence of its own history. She had access to the best imaginable partner in that work, someone who remembered the original structure with perfect clarity and who had, in 100 years of suspended consciousness, apparently done a great deal of thinking about what he would do differently. They disagreed often. They negotiated always. The disagreements were the best part of her days, which she told him. And he laughed, which was a sound she was accumulating like evidence, the specific joy of watching someone who had been suspended in grief and time remember how to find things funny. The side. Formal coronation, when it came, was witnessed by the full assembly of the Northern Reach, every pack represented, the recognition rite completed in its most permanent and public form, under the open sky of the gathering grounds where Lyra had first spoken, the words that started all of this. She stood in the old ceremonial dress, reconstructed from the records with care, and a great deal of collaboration with the pack's textile elders, in amber gold that matched her wolf. And she thought about Elder Corvus sending her up the mountain because she was expendable and available, and no one imagined she would be anything else. And she thought about 3 nights in a cold archive reading a dead woman's love letters. And she thought about a glacier opening like a door, and she thought about the wolf that had been there all along, patient and warm, waiting for the moment it would be safe to be seen. Kale placed the consort's circlet on her head and looked at her with the expression she had been learning for weeks now, the one that was both ancient and immediate, the one that contained 100 years, and also just this moment, and said quietly enough that only she could hear it. "I told you. Precisely on time." "I am always precisely on time," she said. "I just usually arrive somewhere no one is watching." "Someone was always watching," he said. "It just took the right someone 100 years to wake up." The assembly witnessed and the record was made, and the northern reach, which had been governed for a century by the careful architecture of a man's ambition, oriented itself around something older and less calculated and more real. The simple axis of a destiny that had survived everything thrown at it, and arrived finally, in the moment it was meant to arrive, with a woman who had always been there, and a king who had always been waiting, and a wolf the color of amber fire running free under winter stars. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?